Okay, you need to behave out there because we're recording.
And in here's the one you have to worry about.
Yeah. All right, now I gotta change this guy. Okay, welcome to week 2 of Roman Judea. Thanks for showing up again. I'm gonna switch to full screen here and show those guys again in case somebody. Somehow I made them completely disappear. I don't know how to make them come back so I can see them. There we go.
There they are.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, sorry, we'll get started. Welcome to week 2 of Roman Judea. One thing that we left last week, I left you in a confused state about the menorah. And so I wanted to clarify. Remember, we were talking about why are there 7 branches on the menorah? And then Joe said, actually, there's 9 branches on the menorah.
9, yeah.
We're like, what? So there are 2 different menorahs, okay? The original menorah, the one that I was talking about, was the one that was in Solomon's temple, really kind of like one of the most important artifacts inside the temple, this lamp that the Hasmoneans lit after they recaptured the temple. So that one is actually described in the Torah, in the books of the Bible that are telling about the contents of what needs to be inside the tabernacle, what needs to be inside the temple, and so forth. So that's where the design of the 7-branch lamp inside the temple comes from. And those 7 branches were fueled by oil, all right? And that was the lamp that miraculously burned for 8 days, even though they thought they only had 1 day's worth of oil, and that's the origin of the celebration of Hanukkah. Yeah. So the Hanukkah menorah,
yeah, nicer screen on that.
Oh.
the menorah, as Joe pointed out to us last week, has 8 branches on, 4 on either side, and then there's a central place that holds a candle, and you use that candle to light the other candles on the 8 branches during Hanukkah. So that menorah was designed specifically for a celebration of Hanukkah. So hopefully we've cleared up the menorah mystery. Yeah.
Where was the second one? Kept?
The second one wasn't kept anywhere. That's just a ceremonial thing.
Okay. So there are a lot of them.
There are a lot of those, exactly. All right. One of my favorite things about tonight's session is that we get to talk about some of the largest characters from ancient and Roman history, right? We're going to talk about Julius Caesar. We're going to talk about Cleopatra. We're going to talk about Mark Antony. We're going to talk about Augustus. They all play a role in tonight's story. And so I thought I would give you a little trivia challenge on Cleopatra, probably the most famous of the 4, perhaps Julius Caesar. But I'm going to test your knowledge. If you've carefully watched, your Elizabeth Taylor movies in your life or your Vivian Lee movies, you should be able to get these answers. All right. Cleopatra was supposed to rule Egypt jointly with her brother, but he exiled her, as we're going to learn tonight. How did she sneak herself into a room with Julius Caesar, whom she hoped would restore her to power? Does anybody remember how she snuck herself into that room?
Involves snakes.
What was that? An ass. All right, very good. All right. And then the last one, was Cleopatra a babe?
I don't know.
All right, well, here are the answers. All right, so How did she
Wow.
sneak herself into a room with Julius Caesar?
Oh,
According to legend, she had herself rolled up into a carpet, and a traitor brought the carpet into Julius Caesar, unrolled the carpet, and Cleopatra fell out onto the carpet. Right in there, okay? And this picture is from Caesar and the movie Caesar and Cleopatra, with Vivian Lee playing Cleopatra and
Long.
Claude Rains playing Julius Caesar. So, all right. We got the answer on how she committed suicide. So supposedly, according to one version, it was the bite of an asp. Okay? Depicted many, many times in art throughout history. This is one painting here. Several different ancient sources say she took poison and took it a couple of different ways. Okay. So the third one, obviously, is kind of a judgment call. Was Cleopatra a babe? And this is an actual butt of Cleopatra. Now, if you were to ask my father-in-law, right, he would tell you that Elizabeth Taylor was the most beautiful woman of her day, right? And same with Vivian Lee, right? Very glamorous actresses who've been cast to play Cleopatra. But, you know,
not so much.
the real Cleopatra, I might be in a different camp on that.
Good grief. She's got a big nose.
Yeah, I was gonna say, big nose.
All right, so we've had enough fun. Let's get into it. This is the course outline. Last week, we talked about the Maccabean revolt, right? And that brief period of Jewish independence. But as we saw, the Maccabees really had to lean heavily on and kind of leverage a relationship with the Romans, okay? Tonight, we're going to talk about King Herod the Great, who is what is called a Roman client king. We're going to learn what that means, what it means to be a Roman client king and his relationship to the Romans and just how much leverage or autonomy to rule. Next week, we will talk about the period where Judea becomes a Roman prefecture. It's under the direct control of a Roman official, or at least parts of it are, as opposed to a native ruler like Herod. And then we'll finish up with the Jewish revolt, which is the end of the second temple period. The second temple being Solomon's temple that was rebuilt by the Persians, Cyrus the Great, and will be destroyed by the Romans around 70 AD. As a review of what we covered last week, we started with a very quick overview of 1,000 years of Jewish history to kind of give us a baseline. Clark is pointing in. Give us some foundational information that we needed to remember for this class. So remember that the kingdom was divided after Solomon. We had Judah in the north, in the south. It contained Jerusalem and the temple. In the north was Israel. Israel was conquered about 140 years before Judah was. Israel was conquered by the Assyrians. And one of the practices of the Assyrians was they resettled the populations in their empire. So they moved a lot of the Jews out of Israel, and they moved a lot of other peoples into Israel. So what you end up with is, number one, the 10 lost tribes. That's where that trope comes from, is when the Assyrians basically scattered the peoples in Israel. But you also get this mixed populace in the northern part of what used to be Israel, and a small group who still try to worship Yahweh, but they don't have access to the temple. And so they are viewed as kind of half Jews, if you will, by the true Jews down in Judah. And those are the Samaritans. And that's the reason why the Samaritans are depicted so poorly in the New Testament. So we saw that after the northern tribes had been conquered, about 140 years later, Judah itself was conquered. The Babylonians destroyed Solomon's temple. And then after a period of Babylonian exile, the Persians let the Jews return to Judah, and they actually rebuilt the temple for them. And that's again where we get the second temple period. And the Persians themselves were conquered by the Greeks, by Alexander the Great. And we saw that Alexander's empire divided into pieces. Yeah,
Excuse me.
that's somebody else. Wendy wants in. Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
I appreciate it. Keep me honest. So the Greek Empire divided into pieces, and we had two components of the Greek Empire vying for control over Judah. The main thing that we learned about last week was the revolt of the Maccabees and their rule, right? The Greeks tried to impose the pagan religion on the people of Judah. And that's what spurred the Maccabees to revolt against them. It was basically a religious rebellion against their Greek overlords. The Hasmoneans, which is another name for the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans were able to kind of eke out a sort of autonomous existence against their Greek overlords, largely by kind of making an alliance with the new power that was coming into play in the Mediterranean world, the Empire of Rome. So during this period where they're able to act independently, the Hasmoneans conquered and then forcibly converted to Judaism, the surrounding territories around Judah. Most importantly, Samaria, which was the core of the old kingdom of Israel, Galilee, which was at the northern edge of the old kingdom of Israel, and Idumea, which was to the south. And Idumea is important, particularly for tonight's lecture, because that's where the family of Herod the Great comes from. We saw that kind of the end of Hasmonean independence came about as a result of a civil war between two brothers who were fighting over the throne. And that civil war happened to coincide with Rome conquering the Greeks who were in control of Syria and basically moving directly right into the neighborhood alongside Judea. The Hasmonean king Hyrcanus became a Roman client king, just like King Herod will be, although he was given the title of ethnarch rather than king, ruler of a people, which is kind of a notch below king in the Roman lexicon, okay? And what we saw last week and where we left off was that the real power behind the throne, Hyrcanus was kind of a weak-minded individual, and the person who was really the power behind his throne was a guy named Antipater the Idumean. And Antipater is the father of Herod the Great. So we're starting to see how Herod is going to be able to come to power. So any questions about what we covered last week before we jump into this week's content? Okay. All right, so let's talk about the rise of Antipater. He's already kind of the power behind the throne. He's going to become even more powerful under the Romans, okay? So the Romans had made Hyrcanus their tax collector, their ethnarch, okay? So they've given him sort of authority over the region of Judea, but he has to pay tribute to the Romans. That's the deal. You can govern, you can run the day-to-day affairs so long as we get paid, right? That's how the client-king relationship works. Well, Hyrcanus proved to be an incompetent tax collector as far as the Romans were concerned. So they deposed him as ethnarch. They did allow him to remain in power as high priest, okay? So he's not completely out of the picture, but they made Antipater the governor of the region, and they gave him the tax collecting job in Jerusalem, right? They saw him as a more capable individual than Hyrcanus. So while that is happening, while we're getting this kind of change of power in Judea, we've got important events going on back in Rome. There's a civil war between Pompey and Julius Caesar. Pompey, we've already spent time talking about. He's the general who actually led the conquest of Syria. He's the general member who basically arbitrated the dispute between Jerusalem, offended the Jews by doing what? Everybody remember? He went into the temple and stepped inside the Holy of Holies, right? The place that nobody other than the priests is allowed to go, okay? All right, so there's a civil war between him and Julius Caesar. They're basically fighting to be the first man in Rome, the most powerful man in Rome. And Caesar emerges victorious in this battle. And Pompey basically has to flee to Egypt, where he's got some followers, and he's going to try and regroup and rebuild his forces. So Pompey lands in Egypt, thinking he's going to be able to kind of rebuild his power base and go back and challenge Caesar again. But what happens is that a Roman who's down there, thinking he can curry favor with Caesar, stabs Pompey as he gets off his boat. He cuts off Pompey's head and he pickles it in a bottle of brine. Okay? So Julius Caesar is hot on the heels of Pompey. He's trying to chase down Pompey and finally put an end to his rival once and for all. And when he gets to Egypt, he arrives with a very small force, like 4,000 men, okay? Because speed is what he's concerned about more than anything else. And Caesar sometimes gets himself in trouble as a general because he moves too quickly and doesn't always bring all the forces with him that he needs. And he always ends up figuring a way out of his jam. But that's one of his kind of attributes as a general, is that he'll overextend his supply lines or move too quickly. Always surprises his enemies, but sometimes he gets in trouble for it too. So he arrives in Egypt, and this person who had cut off Pompey's head thinks he's going to get on Caesar's good side by presenting the head to Caesar. And according to, the histories, Caesar was revolted by this, right? We've got this famous painting here of the guy trying to present the head of Pompey to Caesar, and Caesar's like, you have disrespected a great Roman general. So he has that guy executed, and he has Pompey's head buried with all due ceremony. So now Caesar is in Egypt, and he finds out that there's a dynastic dispute going on in Egypt between the boy and the girl who have been left as co-rulers of Egypt by their father, okay? The girl is none other than Cleopatra, and her brother exiles her and kicks her out of the country and takes power for himself, right? So Julius Caesar is there. Now he's got the opportunity to intervene in this dispute, and more importantly, to bring Egypt under the control of Rome. Egypt being the richest ancient country in the Mediterranean, and this would be a major coup for the Romans to bring Egypt under their control. But remember, Caesar is there. He only has 4,000 troops under his command. And so what happens is the Egyptian king, basically his general, rallies the royal army of 20,000 soldiers, and they lay siege to Caesar. And Caesar is bottled up in the Egyptian city of Alexandria by a force 5 times the size of what he controls. He's in real trouble. Now he has sent for reinforcements. He's sent to Asia Minor, and he's sent to Syria asking for additional troops. And as it happens, this relieving force that's making its way down from Syria comes through Judea, and Hyrcanus and Antipater not only give additional troops to this force that's on its way to help Caesar, but they also understand that there are a lot of Jews living in Egypt, and the Jewish army is comprised largely of Jewish mercenaries. And so they convince these Jewish mercenaries, who are basically manning the garrisons at the entrance to Egypt, to let this army in. And so this army is able to get in and save Caesar's grits there in Alexandria, and Caesar is able to restore Cleopatra to the throne. So Caesar is beholden to, he is grateful for the assistance of Hyrcanus and Antipater. So he restores Hyrcanus to the title he had been stripped of not long ago. Hyrcanus is made ethnarch again, but he gives Antipater general taxing authority, not just in Jerusalem, but throughout the whole region of Judea. And he names Antipater's sons regional governors. So this is where Herod gets his first crack at power. Julius Caesar puts Herod in power as the governor of Galilee. And Herod quickly proves himself to be a very competent ruler, at least from the Roman standpoint. The biggest problem that's going on in Galilee and the surrounding region is that there's a bandit who's got a little army of followers, and he's causing havoc throughout the region, descending on villages, pillaging them, and then disappearing into the wilderness. So Herod cuts his teeth by tracking down this bandit and bringing him to justice. And as we're going to see, the Jews don't like Antipater, they don't like Herod, because they're not viewed as real Jews, right? They're Idumeans. They're this other race that the Hasmoneans converted to Judaism, right? So they worship Yahweh, but they don't have the bloodline, right? They're not of the same tribes as the Judeans. And so even though Herod had successfully brought this bandit to justice and arguably made life easier for the Jews living there, okay, the Jews criticize him as being too harsh on the bandits and dealing with them. So Herod can't win with the Jews. And as we're going to see, that's going to be one of the stories of his reign. That despite a lot of successes, despite a lot of greatness, Herod is never going to fully measure up in the eyes of his Jewish subjects. So Antipater ends up being assassinated in 443 BC. And at the same time that he's assassinated, we have these events going on in Rome, okay? Caesar himself was assassinated the previous year, 44 BC, on the Ides of March, okay? So after Caesar was assassinated, what happens in the Roman Empire is a civil war ensues between the guys that assassinated Caesar and Caesar's followers. So the guys that assassinated Caesar are Brutus and Cassius, and Caesar's followers are Mark Antony and Caesar's adopted son, a kid named Octavian. So a big battle occurs a couple of years later in 42 BC, the Battle of Philippi, and the assassins Brutus and Cassius are killed in that battle. So now we have what's called the Second Triumvirate, rule of three men. The two biggies in the Second Triumvirate are Antony and Octavian, okay? And they divide up all the territories that the Romans control, and Antony ends up with the east. He gets Egypt and Judea. So Antony moves to Egypt, and this is where he begins his affair with Cleopatra. And as we're going to see, Cleopatra, even though as we saw, she's maybe not the most beautiful woman in the world, she has some kind of charms because Antony, as we're going to find out, becomes completely besotted by her and end up in the end, he's going to throw everything away on his love for. We're going to get into the final chapter of the Hasmoneans here, the last gasp of Hasmonean rule. All right, so remember that Hyrcanus, the ethnarch, the guy who was teamed up with Antipater, right, and helped Julius Caesar out of his jam, Hyrcanus had started his reign in a civil war with his own brother Aristobulus. Okay, and Aristobulus got on the wrong side of Pompey and ended up being taken captive and executed back in Rome. So Aristobulus had a son named Antigonus. So Antigonus was the son of Aristobulus. He was the nephew of Hyrcanus, the current ethnarch. Okay, he wants to claim what he believes was his father's rightful throne as king of Judea. So he allies himself with another one of the great powers in the region, the Parthians. They're kind of a remnant of the Persian Empire who have gradually been coming back into power in the region of Iran, and now are kind of knocking on the door of Judea, okay? They're going to be the Romans' arch rivals to the east for much of Roman history. So Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus, the nephew of Hyrcanus, allies himself with the Parthians, and they invade Roman Syria, take Syria from the Romans, take Judea, and they install Antigonus as their puppet king in Judea around the year 40 BC. So Antigonus calls his uncle into him, Hyrcanus, who's both the high priest and the ethnarch that the Romans have put in power, and Antigonus bites the ears off of his uncle, okay? Physically deforming him so that he can no longer, under any circumstances, serve as high priest anymore, okay?
Did he pickle the ears?
I don't know the ears of that. That's great. So while this is all happening, Herod, who had been the Roman appointed governor of Galilee, he flees to Rome, right? So now the Parthians and Antigonus are in control of Judea. So back in Rome, the Romans are trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to retrieve this mess? How are we going to get Syria back? Okay. Less importantly, how are we going to get Judea? But Herod is there, and Herod, as we're going to see, is a very persuasive guy. And he endears himself to the Roman Senate, and in particular, impresses the two most important guys, Mark Antony and Octavian, the two guys who are really running the show. So Mark Antony, Octavian, and the Senate name Herod king of Judea, and they give him resources to go back and take Judea back from the Parthians, from Antigonus. And indeed, with Roman backing, Herod is able to accomplish this in 37 BC. So that begins the reign of Herod the Great, okay, 37 BC. So he's got these Roman troops that he has used to recapture Judea. And typically, what the Roman troops get to do, part of their pay, part of their reward, is that when they're successful, they get to loot whatever city they've just captured. Well, Herod doesn't want his reign to start off on the wrong foot. So he actually, out of his own resources, pays the Roman troops not to loot Jerusalem. He then brings the elderly and deformed Hyrcanus back from exile, okay, keeps him close to his side. And Herod marries Hyrcanus's granddaughter, a woman named Mariamne. Mariamne is a Hasmonean on both sides. Her parents were first cousins. And what Herod is doing here, remember, he's an Idumean. He is not viewed as fully Jewish as one of us by the Jews of Judea. So he wants to basically associate himself as much as he can with the Jewish people, and more importantly, with their legitimate rulers, the Hasmoneans. So he marries this Hasmonean woman, and unfortunately for him, he's already got a wife and a son, but he gets rid of them. He sends them into exile, banishes them from his presence. So they're no longer part of the picture. He's now exclusively married to this Hasmonean woman, Mariamne. Mariamne's mother turns out to be a very annoying mother-in-law. Her name is Alexandra. Okay, so she is Mariamne's mother. She's Hyrcanus's daughter. Okay. And she wants her son made high priest. She wants a Hasmonean high priest. Now, Herod had already installed a prominent Babylonian Jew, and he doesn't want a Hasmonean priest. He doesn't want any threats to his power, and he feels like a Hasmonean priest could stir up trouble for him, right? Because the population is already pro-Hasmonean, but anti-Idumean, right? So he doesn't need any trouble from that quarter. Alexandra then goes and appeals to Cleopatra, right? And why is Cleopatra important? Because she's the girlfriend of Mark Antony, and Mark Antony is really the guy calling the shots in the East, okay? So Cleopatra, reading her history, realizes that her Ptolemaic ancestors, right, the successors of Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy, her ancestors used to control Judea, right? Remember, we learned that back when they divided up Alexander's empire. It was the Egyptian general who got control of Judea at first. So Cleopatra decides she wants control of Judea, and Herod needs to go. So in this conflict with, Cleopatra kind of appeals to her boyfriend Antony, and Herod realizes he's got a problem. So he gives in to Alexandra and hopes that this will calm things down. So 36 BC, he appoints Alexander's son as the new high priest, but within a year, this boy dies a very kind of mysterious death. It happens at a party that Alexandra is hosting, right? So Herod can plausibly claim that he had nothing to do with it, but what apparently happens is that this kid dies during, quote, horseplay in the pool, okay? So anyway, obviously Herod was probably behind it, but because it happened at Alexandra's house, nobody can prove it, okay? And Alexandra, knowing something is up, but she can't prove it under Jewish law, she goes back to Cleopatra and complains again. So now Cleopatra is able to convince Antony to summon Herod to Egypt. So Herod goes there not knowing if he's going to get executed by the Romans there, or if he's going to leave being completely stripped of power. But again, he uses his charming personality, his charisma, to talk his way out of it, right? He convinces Antony to leave him in power, and Antony can't completely ignore the appeals of his girlfriend Cleopatra, so he gives Cleopatra the city of Jericho, okay? So she gets a little bit, and Herod is a little bit diminished in power, but he's able to stay on his throne. Well, a couple of years later, we get, again, there can only be one ruler of the Roman Empire, okay? Antony and Octavian duke it out for top man, okay? Herod is forced to choose, and he figures, I probably better go with Antony. He's right here on the scene, okay? And maybe worse comes to worse, they can't resolve things, and it's left with the two of them still in power. Antony's going to be the guy that I have to deal with. So he sides with Antony in this dispute. And as Antony is headed north to deal with Octavian, he tells Herod to make war on the Nabateans to the south of Judea. So the big resolution between the conflict between Antony and Octavian occurs at a Greek city called Actium, the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. This is actually a naval battle between the naval forces of Antony and the naval forces of Octavian. And as this battle is raging, and Antony is on his ship, the flagship, commanding the fleet, things are looking a little bit shaky, and Cleopatra, who has accompanied him on her own ship, she decides to turn tail and head back to Egypt. She doesn't like the way things are going. And Antony, as we've seen, completely besotted by this woman, sees her ship sailing away, and even though the battle is swirling around him, other ships are looking to him for command decisions, he decides he's got to follow Cleopatra. He can't let her get away from him. So he follows, and of course, the battle goes resoundingly against his forces. So now Antony and Cleopatra end up in Egypt, and hot on their heels is Octavian. Octavian has become sole master of Rome, and it's not long after that Antony and Cleopatra are forced to commit suicide. So now Octavian calls Herod to come pay him a visit. And Herod again is wondering what is going to happen to me. I sided with Antony in this battle, okay? So before he leaves, just to make sure that there's no trouble behind him, he executes old Hyrcanus on a trumped up charge of treason. He doesn't want Hyrcanus being the source of any kind of revolution. And interestingly, he leaves instructions with his chief guys to have Mariamne killed if he doesn't return safely, right? And he later claims that he couldn't bear to be apart from her even in death, okay? But as we're going to see, Herod, for all the great things that he does and the successes he has as kings, he has really got some quirky personality traits. And this order to have his wife killed if he doesn't return is one of them. All right, so Herod again is able to sweet talk Octavian and keep his place in power. So he returns from this meeting with Octavian. But Mariamne, surprisingly, is a little icy. He has found out about these orders to have her killed if he didn't return, and she's not too happy about it. Okay. Now, Mariamne, his wife, is acting coldly to him, and so this is when Herod's sister, Salome, starts a whispering campaign to convince Herod to kill Mariamne, his wife. And why would Salome do this? Well, Salome, like Herod, is an Idumean, right? Not fully Jewish, whereas Mariamne is a Hasmonean. She's the real deal. And so apparently, Mariamne has kind of been sticking the needle into Salome, right? And the women at court, maybe kind of look down their noses at Salome. So this is Salome's opportunity to get revenge on her sister-in-law who has been belittling her, okay? Amazing that history comes down to these little petty disputes, but sometimes it does. So Herod, listening to Salome's appeals and seeing, that Mariamne is indeed acting icy toward him, puts his wife on trial, okay? And this is where Alexandra, his mother-in-law, Mariamne's mom, shows her true spots, right? She's afraid that she's going to get caught up and executed along with her daughter. So she actually turns coat and testifies against her daughter and helps make the case that Mariamne has been conspiring against Herod. And so Herod executes his wife, Mariamne. Apparently, after this, after executing his wife, Herod becomes racked with grief and or guilt. And he kind of goes into this bender where he just takes all kinds of excesses, goes on these long hunting trips. He's not acting like a responsible king at all. And rumors start to circulate that during one of these prolonged absences that he has actually been killed on a hunting expedition.
Yeah, I need to order a couple of
While
pizzas.
he's gone, Alexandra says, "This is my opportunity." She tries to bribe some of the military leaders and seize power for herself, right? To restore the Hasmoneans' power. Herod discovers the plot and executes Alexandra. Okay?
I need a large classic.
All right.
Large.
Couple other key
large
events
point
in the reign of Herod, who's now securely on the throne. He's basically executed all the Hasmoneans who can
Yep.
potentially rival him. Okay? But in 25 BC, there's a massive.
Am I muted?
I'll be there.
Judea, a famine is descending on the
Yeah.
land. And this is where Herod does something that
Okay.
shows that despite
work.
these kind of
Okay, thanks.
behaviors that he has, and definitely the personal ruthlessness that he shows when his back is against the wall, he's actually a pretty good king. Because he empties the royal treasury and he sells valuables from his palace, furniture, gold plates, and whatnot, in order to import grain from Egypt and prevent the starvation of his people. So let's talk about some of the building projects that Herod undertakes while he's king from 37 BC to 4 BC. So 33 years he rules. The biggie is that he rebuilds the temple, the second temple that Cyrus the Great had built for the Jews back in the 500s, right? So that temple, was over 500 years old at that point. And Solomon says, we need to rebuild it in a grander fashion. Now, in the Bible, it specifies that not just anybody can build the temple. It has to be priests that do it. And so in order to make this happen, Herod trains an army of priests in the necessary skills in masonry and carpentry to build those special sacred portions of the temple. He's following all the strictures. None of the Jews are going to be able to complain about this when it's done. And if you were to go to Jerusalem now, right, you could see part of what Herod had built. The Wailing Wall in Jerusalem is actually what remains of a massive platform that Herod had constructed to put his temple on top of. So in this rendering, we don't know exactly what it looks like, but this platform here that the temple would have sat on, that's what the Wailing Wall is.
Oh.
When he was finished, it was such an amazing structure that everybody in the ancient world was astonished by it. There was actually an ancient proverb that said, "He who has not seen Herod's temple has not seen anything beautiful." So, grand accomplishment. A second great accomplishment in his building program was the port of Caesarea. So before he started, this was just a little backwater fishing town without a usable harbor for military ships or anything like that. Herod wanted to make sure that he had a port, a harbor of the first order for his kingdom. So using the latest technology in hydraulic cement that you can actually put underwater and it will dry underwater, okay, which the Romans had developed. Herod has this artificial port built for the city of Caesarea. This city is going to be become as large in size as Jerusalem itself, and it's really going to be the first city in Judea. That's where the Roman procurators and prefects are going to establish their headquarters. That's where Pilate will make his headquarters. So Caesarea is named in honor of Julius Caesar and Octavian, his son, who also took the name Caesar, Augustus Caesar. So that's where that name comes from.
What's the name of the town?
Caesarea. So you see it contains Caesar in the name, okay? In Latin, Caesar is actually pronounced Caesar. Notable fort is Masada, okay? This fort that's built on top of a mountain, and of course, that's where the Jewish rebels are going to hold out against the Romans in the Jewish revolt, okay? And as awesome of a palace or fort as it was, the Romans are the one force in the world that are going to be able to take it. He rebuilds the city of Samaria. The Hasmoneans had destroyed it. Remember, they hated the Samaritans, right? Because they're these Yahwist pretenders who had their own temple, okay? And who pretended like they were real Jews when they're not. So the Hasmoneans had destroyed Samaria. Herod rebuilds it, but he renames it Sebast, which is Greek for Augustus, right? So again, he knows which side his bread is buttered on, okay? He's always going to try and curry favor with Augustus. He builds one city, gives it a Roman name, another city, gives it a Greek name, both honoring the same God. All throughout Judea, he builds amphitheaters, stadiums, baths, gymnasiums. He's making his province, his kingdom, a up-to-date, modern, Greco-Roman type place, okay? Recognizable for any of the upper crust. When they come and visit, they're going to say, this is the real deal here. Basically puts the Greco-Roman stamp on Judea. So what was his reign like? The general character of Herod's reign, how did he manage to keep power when the people hated him, basically? Well, he employed a network of spies to head off unrest. So he knows what's going on. If there's trouble brewing, he's going to find out about it and be able to stamp it out early. His spy network is so effective, there are actually rumors, a belief that Herod himself puts on a disguise and goes out and mingles among the people in order to understand what they're saying about him, what their concerns are. He generally maintains peace throughout his reign in his kingdom, right? He doesn't massacre his subjects, although it's possible. The exception is Bethlehem, right? We have the Gospels as a source for that. It's unlikely that he did that. There's no other source telling us, and it seems like something that Josephus would have mentioned. But as we're going to see, it's definitely in Herod's character, right? If he detects any threat to his reign, right, he will stop at nothing to quash it. He does tax his people very heavily to pay for all these improvements. That's going to be a source of his unpopularity. But one thing that he does that the Jews should appreciate is he provides support to the Jews of the diaspora, the Jews living in all the other cities of the Roman Empire, the Mediterranean world. And they're really all over the place. One estimate is that they might have been 10% of the total population of the Roman Empire. There was a Jewish community in Rome. There were a bunch in Asia Minor, okay, a bunch in Greece. And the problem from the Roman standpoint of the Jews is that the Jews won't worship the pagan gods. And for the Romans, that's not just a religious thing, that's also a patriotic thing, because it's these pagan gods who have made the Roman Empire great, okay? It's by making the gods happy and appeasing them that the weather is good enough that we have crops every year. So when you refuse to worship the pagan gods of your locality, right, that is an act of disloyalty. But Herod manages to convince the Romans that, look, the Jews are quirky. It's this ancient religion, and it's always been this way. They're not going to be troublesome citizens. Just leave them alone. And the Romans basically do. They come to view the Jews as kind of this eccentric group, but they tolerate them. So after Herod has murdered or executed his wife, Mariamne, okay, now he's got to figure out, okay, who's my heir going to be? And he goes back, remember he had that wife and son that he had banished early on when he married Mariamne? So he goes back and brings those people out of exile, and he makes his first son, Antipater, who he named after his father, he makes him his heir apparent, puts him in a prominent role in government. That kid had been exiled with his mom at the time that Herod married Mariamne. At the same time, he also brings back his two sons by Mariamne. These boys he had sent to Rome early on so that they could be raised in Roman fashion and develop all the relationships that they needed to develop with the Romans, right? And so he brings them back. So now he's got his three sons there, one not by Mariamne, and that kid's two half brothers, the fully Hasmonean kids, or they at least had Hasmonean blood in them from their mother, if they're not fully Hasmonean themselves. These two boys, the ones with Hasmonean blood, proved to be the popular ones among the Jews, right? Because they've got that Hasmonean blood. So again, we've got Salome, the troublemaker, Herod's sister, okay, the one who had engineered the execution of Mariamne. So she and Antipater kind of realized that they've got common cause, right? They're the non-Hasmoneans in the court. So they conspire against the two boys with Hasmonean blood, and they basically whisper in Herod's ear. He's a paranoid guy. He's always receptive to these kind of things. They whisper in his ear that the two Hasmonean boys, the ones who are so popular among the Jews, are conspiring to take his throne, Herod. So Herod has them executed in 6 BC. Well, after that happens, Antipater really does conspire to take Herod's throne, and so Herod has him executed too. So this bloodbath of Herod's sons, when the word reaches Augustus, he just shakes his head and says, it's better to be Herod's pig than his son, right? Because Herod, being a Jew, won't eat pork, okay? So it's better to be his pig than to be his son. All right. Herod finally dies in 4 BC. He falls ill. It's a horrible illness, never seen before, and so it's given the name Herod's evil. The symptoms of Herod's evil are a putrescent stomach, corpse-like breath, maggots breeding in the privy member, and a constant watery flow from the bowels causing inflamed madness.
How can corpses breathe?
Herod realizes that his days are numbered, but he's afraid that when he dies, right, nobody's going to mourn him because he's been such a popular ruler. So what he does is he summons several of the most popular people in the kingdom to be near him. And he sends an order that when he dies, when Herod dies, he wants these other guys killed too, so that there will be this general outpouring of grief. And people will think that Herod was being mourned.
Oh, dear.
All right, so as I said, Herod's legacy is that the Jews hate him, right? And the question is why? He really had built Judea into a great power of sorts, and he had done an excellent job of managing relations with the Romans, okay? And made Judea kind of this jewel of the Roman Empire. So why did the Jews hate him? And we also saw that he had supported the Jews of the diaspora, basically convinced the Romans to be tolerant of them. Well, a couple of reasons, right? We talked about the high taxes that Herod had put in place. They made Judea a power of note, but he also used that money, to support the Olympic Games and become Augustus's friend. He had used it for, Hellenizing the kingdom, basically. Okay? He had been even-handed with his pagan subjects, right? Which the Jews don't like. They should be treated as second-class citizens, but Herod treated them equally. Okay. Like I said, he put the Greco-Roman stamp on Judea, and the conservative Jews don't like to have gymnasiums in their neighborhood where people exercise in the nude. Okay. And some of his chief counselors were Greeks, right? That shouldn't be the case. It should just be Jews. And of course, the real reason is that he just wasn't a real Jew. He was an Idumean. He was a fake Jew. He was a pretender, not one of us. So that's Herod's legacy. Interesting character, a lot of great attributes. Personally, a very sinister individual, but in those times, it almost had to be that way to stay in power. So next week, we will talk about the successors of King Herod. What happens after King Herod's death in terms of power in Judea? Any questions about what I covered tonight? Yeah.
You were talking about Herod annihilating people, and that the gospel said that he was the one that ordered all of the babies to be killed.
Yes.
But he died in 4 BC, didn't he, before Jesus was born?
Well, that's one of the things that we're gonna talk about is the dating of Jesus's birth is, yes.
So this is the same Herod in the Bible.
This is the same Herod. Yep, this is the Herod who the wise men visited, right? All three of them, right? And they told them about the birth of this king, and according to the gospel, Herod ordered the execution of all the babies under 2 years old in Bethlehem to make sure that there were no rivals to his throne.
And this is the same Herod
The
who
same Herod.
ordered the death of Christ.
Nope.
That's
So
what-
the death of Christ is going to be a different Herod.
Okay.
And yes, one of the things we're gonna learn in this class is how to keep the Herods straight.
Lots of Herod.
As Beth just pointed out, wait, he died 4 years before Jesus was born, so how could he order the death of Jesus? Well, the chronology of Jesus's birth was established by a monk in the 300s, and his math wasn't too good. So, what's that? Right, it should be 2018. Or actually 2026, actually, right? Yes, so.
Okay.
Good. Well, thank you very much for turning out on a cold night to listen to me ladder on. You know. Resume the story next week, if you're so inclined. All right, I'm gonna see how I stop recording.
Fascinating. Thanks so much.